They said the rocks had been there for 10,000 years. Gray, jagged, unforgiving. They rose from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast that had refused to die, and in the valley below, the men in clean white shirts shook their heads and called it what it was. Worthless. Barren, a graveyard of stone where nothing green had ever dared to dream. The limestone baked in the summer sun until it was too hot to touch, and in the winter, the wind howled across its face with a voice that sounded like mourning. For a century, the farmers of Millbrook Valley had looked up at those 7 acres of broken stone and seen only what wasn't there. No topsoil, no water, no hope. Just a jagged scar on the landscape, a place where even weeds went to die. But Clara was 17. And she had a different word for it, home. Her boots crunched against the shale as she climbed the slope that morning, the sun barely bleeding over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry oranges. The air was still cool, carrying the smell of dust and dew, and her breath plumed in small clouds as she walked. She carried a burlap sack over her shoulder, and inside that sack, clinking like hidden treasure, were 37 glass jars. Each one held something the world had told her was foolish. Each one held a seed, a tomato seed, small, brown, impossibly fragile, and in the eyes of everyone who mattered in Millbrook Valley, impossibly stupid. Dr. Harrison had stood right there on this very hillside 3 days earlier. He had driven up in his dusty sedan with the government plates, wearing his khaki trousers and his polished boots, carrying a leather folder full of soil analysis reports and satellite imagery. He had walked the land with Clara's uncle, measuring pH levels and shaking his head at the drainage, and when he had looked at Clara with the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a dismissal, a polite, educated, devastating dismissal. "Young lady," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of every diploma hanging on his office wall, "this soil is 70% limestone aggregate. The water retention is negligible. The root penetration depth before hitting bedrock is 4 inches. 4 inches. You could plant tomatoes here from now until the second coming, and the only thing you'd harvest is disappointment." Everyone had laughed. Her uncle had laughed. The men from the co-op had laughed. Even the old women at the church bake sale had clucked their tongues and whispered that the grief had finally broken the girl, that losing her father and then the farm had been too much for a 17-year-old mind to bear. They had watched her grow up, watched her follow her father through the fields with her own tiny set of tools, watched her learn to read the land before she learned to read books. And now they watched her throw it all away on a pile of rocks, and they pitied her almost as much as they judged her. They called her crazy. They called it impossible, and Clara called them wrong. She reached the flat shelf of rock halfway up the hillside, the place where the wind had howled through the cracks for centuries, and she set down her sack. Her hands were already blistered from 3 weeks of preparation, of hauling compost up the slope in 5-gallon buckets, of chipping away at the stone with a pickaxe that weighed half as much as she did. Her back ached, her fingers bled, her heart sang, because she was doing something that mattered, because she was keeping a promise that had been made in love, and because she was proving something that no report could measure. Because Clara remembered something the agronomist with his leather folder had forgotten. She remembered her father's voice, rough as gravel and warm as summer hay, telling her stories on the porch when she was small enough to fit in his lap. He had told her about the tomato plants his own grandmother had grown in the old country, in soil so poor the locals had called it the devil's dust. He had told her that tomatoes didn't need perfect soil. They needed stubbornness. They needed someone who believed in them more than the dirt believed in itself. He had told her that the best fruit always came from the hardest ground, because the plant had to fight for every drop of water, every crumb of nutrient, and that fight made the flavor deeper, richer, more alive. "They'll find a way, Clara Bear," he had whispered, his big hand covering her small one. "Plants are just like people. They don't need easy. They just need someone who won't quit." He had been dead for 11 months. The cancer had taken him fast, stealing his strength, then his voice, then his breath, until all that was left was the silence in the farmhouse and the memory of his hands. The bank had taken the Valley farm 3 weeks after the funeral. The land that had been in their family for 3 generations sold to a developer from the city who wanted to build vacation homes. The only thing Clara had left was this hillside, this impossible, ugly, beautiful stretch of rock that her father had bought on a whim 20 years ago because he said it reminded him of his mother's courage. He had never planted a single thing on it. He had just looked at it, sometimes from the kitchen window, and smiled. He had seen something in it that no one else could see, and now Clara saw it too. Now it was hers, all 7 acres of broken stone and stubborn hope, and she was going to plant tomatoes on it if it killed her. She opened the first jar. The seeds smelled like earth and possibility. She had saved them herself, from the last harvest her father had ever grown, selecting only the strongest fruit, the ones with the deepest color and the firmest flesh. She had fermented them in glass bowls on the windowsill, washed them in rainwater, dried them on paper towels in the attic where the summer heat lingered. She had sung to them sometimes when the house was too quiet and the grief was too loud. She had told them her secrets, her fears, her dreams. And now she pressed them into the shallow trenches she had carved into the rock with bleeding fingers, covering them with the precious compost she had hauled up bucket by bucket, whispering the same words her father had whispered to her. Find a way. The first month was war. The sun came down like a hammer, day after day, baking the stone until the air above it shimmered and danced. The compost dried to dust within hours, turning to powder that the wind scattered across the valley like bitter snow. The wind howled across the ridge, tearing at the thin fabric of the shade cloth Clara had strung between rusted rebar stakes, ripping it to ribbons and scattering her careful work across the rocks. She would climb the slope each morning before dawn, carrying water in 2-gallon jugs, her shoulders bruised from the straps, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and she would find her trenches empty, the seeds exposed, the stone as barren as it had been for 10,000 years. The water evaporated before it could sink in. The compost blew away before it could settle. And the stone remained, ancient and indifferent, watching her struggle with the patience of geology. Her uncle came to visit on the 15th day. He stood at the bottom of the hill, his hands in his pockets, his face a mixture of pity and impatience. He had tried to help her after the funeral, had offered her a room in his house, had tried to talk sense into her about the farm and the future, but Clara had refused to leave. And now, watching her destroy herself on a pile of rocks, he had run out of patience. "Clara, honey," he called up, his voice carrying on the wind, "this ain't farming. This is torture. Come down to the valley. I got a job for you at the feed store. Good honest work. You don't need to be up there killing yourself for nothing." She didn't answer. She was on her hands and knees, pressing a new seed into a crack she had widened with a screwdriver, her hair matted to her forehead with sweat and dust. Her fingers were bleeding again, the blood mixing with the dirt to make a thin paste that smelled like iron and earth. "You're just like him," her uncle said, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. "Too stubborn to know when you're beaten. Your daddy was a good man, but he didn't know when to quit either. Look where that got him. Look where that got you." She pressed the seed deeper. "I'm not beaten, Uncle Joe. I'm just beginning." He left. He didn't come back. The 23rd day brought rain. Not the gentle spring rain of the valley, but a violent lashing storm that turned the hillside into a river of mud and stone. Clara stood at the bottom, watching her trenches wash away, watching her compost slide down the slope in brown rivers, watching her dreams dissolve into the muck, and she felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. Something harder. Something that had been holding her together since the funeral. The storm didn't just destroy her work. It destroyed her hope. It showed her, in the most brutal way possible, that the land was stronger than she was, that the rock would outlast her, that the agronomist had been right. She sat down in the mud. The rain soaked through her clothes, cold and bitter and endless. She looked up at the hillside, and for the first time she saw it not as a challenge but as a grave. Her father's grave, her childhood's grave, her future's grave. The water ran down her face, and she couldn't tell if it was rain or tears, and she didn't care. She was empty. She was broken. She was 17 years old, and she had nothing left. And she wept. She wept for the man who had believed in her. She wept for the farm she had lost. She wept for the tomatoes that would never grow, for the agronomist who had been right, for the stupidity of a 17-year-old girl who thought she could conquer 10,000 years of stone with nothing but a sack of seeds and a memory. She wept until her throat was raw and her chest ached, and the storm was just background noise to her grief. The storm lasted 3 hours. Clara sat in the mud for 4, and then, as the clouds began to tear apart and the sun emerged like a hesitant blessing, she wiped her face with her muddy sleeve and she stood up. Her knees shook, her heart hammered, her eyes burned with salt and fury. She looked at the hillside, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. The rain had not just destroyed. It had changed. The water had forced dust and silt into the fissures, creating thin ribbons of mud that hadn't existed before. The water had found paths through the stone, secret channels where moisture could linger. The storm had not destroyed her work. It had shown her a new way. The rock was not her enemy. It was her partner, and it had just told her where to plant. No, she said, not to the storm, not to the hillside, to herself. No, not today. Not ever. She climbed the slope again. The trenches were gone. The compost was gone. But the cracks in the rock remained. And in those cracks, something had changed. She gathered leaf mold from the oak trees at the base of the hill. She collected rabbit droppings from the warren in the eastern boulders. She found patches of moss and scraped them into paste, mixing them with the thin soil that had gathered in the deepest crevices over centuries of wind and neglect. She planted her seeds not in rows but in pockets, not in soil but in stone. She became a student of the rock, learning its moods, its temperatures, its hidden places where dew collected in the early morning and shade lingered in the late afternoon. She planted in 37 different locations. 37 tiny pockets of hope scattered across 7 acres of impossible. And she waited. The first week of June, nothing happened. The second week, nothing happened. The third week, on a Tuesday morning so hot the air smelled like copper, Clara climbed the hill with her water jugs and found it green. Not much, just a thread, a whisper. A single stem no thicker than a thread, pushing up from a crack in the southern face. Its leaves no bigger than her thumbnail, impossibly delicate, impossibly alive. It swayed in the hot wind, defiant and fragile and perfect. Clara fell to her knees. She touched the leaf with a trembling finger, and she felt the texture of it, the velvet of it, the miracle of it. Her breath caught, her vision blurred, and she laughed. A wild, broken, beautiful sound that echoed off the rocks and rolled down into the valley where the people in their clean houses with their green lawns went about their business, never knowing that a 17-year-old girl and a single tomato plant had just declared war on impossible. By July, there were 12 brave green soldiers standing in their stone pockets, reaching for the sun, drinking the water Clara carried up each morning, their roots finding paths through the cracks that no human eye could see. They were stunted, they were strange. They grew sideways and twisted and low to the ground, adapting to their harsh world with a wisdom that humbled the girl who tended them. They were not the tall, proud tomato plants of the valley farms. They were something else, something harder, something forged, something that had earned their place in the world. Clara talked to them. She told them about her father. She told them about the agronomist. She told them about the fear that still woke her at 3 in the morning, the fear that she was wasting her life, that she was a joke, that the laughter of the co-op men would be the soundtrack of her existence forever. And the plants listened in their green, silent way, and they grew. August brought a drought that made the first month look like a gentle spring. The creek at the base of the hill dried to mud. The valley farms turned on their irrigation, drawing from the aquifer that the hillside had no access to. The corn in the lowlands curled and browned, the soybeans withered, and Clara's tomatoes, her impossible, stubborn, beautiful tomatoes, clung to life in their stone pockets because Clara carried water up the hill in the dark before dawn, in the heat of noon, in the purple twilight, until her shoulders were permanently bowed and her hands were permanently stained. She learned to read the stone. She learned which cracks held moisture longest. She learned to mulch with crushed limestone to reflect heat, with pine needles to acidify the thin soil, with her own urine diluted in rainwater to provide nitrogen when the compost ran out. She learned to prune the plants ruthlessly, forcing them to put energy into roots rather than leaves, into survival rather than show. She learned to hand-pollinate with a rabbit hairbrush when the bees refused to climb the barren slope. She learned that impossible was just a word people used when they were afraid to try. And the plants grew. By September, the first fruit appeared, small, hard, green as envy. Clara wept when she saw it, sitting on her heels in the dust, her hand pressed to her mouth, her whole body shaking with a joy so fierce it felt like pain. She didn't touch it. She didn't dare. She let it hang there, a promise made flesh, a green globe of defiance against the gray stone. It ripened on a Sunday. Clara had stopped going to church because Sunday was the only day the feed store was closed, and she could work without interruption. She came up the hill that morning with her water jugs, and she saw it. Red. Not just red, a red so deep it was almost black, a red that seemed to glow against the limestone like a heart beating in a chest of stone. She picked it with both hands, as if it were made of glass. She held it to her nose. The smell hit her like a memory, like her father's greenhouse in July, like the kitchen counter where he had sliced tomatoes for sandwiches, like every summer of her childhood distilled into a single perfect scent. Sweet, earthy, alive. She bit into it standing right there on the hillside, juice running down her chin, seeds spilling onto her shirt, the sun blazing overhead and the wind singing through the rocks. And it was good. It was better than good. It was the best tomato she had ever tasted, because it had been grown not in soil, but in will, not in comfort, but in courage. She had one tomato, one perfect, impossible, beautiful tomato, and she had a hillside full of plants that were still growing. Winter came early that year. The first frost arrived in October, turning the remaining green fruit black and soft, killing the vines that had fought so hard to live. Clara harvested what she could, filling 3 bushel baskets with fruit that ranged from deep red to pale green, from perfect globes to strange, lumpy shapes that had formed in the cramped stone pockets. She carried them down the hill in the cold gray light, her breath plumbing, her fingers numb, and she stored them in the root cellar of the old farmhouse, the one room the bank hadn't taken because it had no value. The valley whispered about her that winter. They said she was madder than ever. They said the one tomato was a fluke, a joke of nature, a statistical anomaly that meant nothing. They said she would starve come spring if she didn't give up the hillside and find real work. Dr. Harrison, the agronomist, wrote a follow-up report that was published in the county extension newsletter, using Clara's hillside as a case study in the dangers of unscientific farming practices and youthful agricultural delusion. Clara read it by candlelight in the root cellar, her breath visible, her hands wrapped in rags against the cold. She read every word, and then she folded the paper carefully, placed it under the bushel basket of her remaining seeds, and she smiled. Because she had something Dr. Harrison didn't have. She had a plan. She spent the winter studying, not in schools, not in libraries, but in the old tool shed where her father had kept his journals. She found notebooks filled with his handwriting observations from 20 years of farming, experiments he had never told anyone about, cross-pollination techniques, soil amendments, root stimulation methods using fish emulsion and willow bark extract. She read them by candlelight, her lips moving, her finger tracing his words, and she felt him beside her in the dark, guiding her, teaching her, believing in her. She also studied the hillside. She walked it in the snow, learning the patterns of melt, the places where the sun hit first, the drainage channels the rain had carved. She mapped it in her mind, 37 locations becoming 50, then 60, then 80. She collected stone dust and mixed it with charcoal and eggshell, creating a mineral supplement that would trick the plants into thinking they had better soil. She saved her own hair, rich with oils and nutrients, and cut it into the compost. She did everything that science would call foolish and everything that love called necessary. And she saved the seeds. Only from the strongest plants. Only from the fruit that had survived the longest. Only from the tomatoes that had tasted the best, that had clung to the rock with the fiercest roots, that had laughed at the drought and spat in the eye of the frost. She planted them in February, in jars on the windowsill, giving them a head start against the stone. She sang to them. She talked to them. She told them about the spring that was coming, about the sun that would warm the rock, about the girl who was waiting for them with bleeding hands and an unbroken heart. March came with mud and false hope. April came with late frosts that killed half her seedlings. May came with a storm that shattered her jars and scattered her work across the kitchen floor. Clara planted again. She was 18 now. The valley had stopped laughing. Now they just shook their heads and looked away when she passed, embarrassed by her persistence, uncomfortable with her refusal to fail. The feed store wouldn't hire her. The church wouldn't seat her. She was alone, completely alone, with her hillside and her seeds and her father's memory. And she had never been more alive. She planted the second year with a fury that bordered on prayer. 80 locations. 80 pockets of hope. She had learned from the first year, and she applied that knowledge with the precision of a general planning a campaign. She planted deeper in the cracks where moisture lingered. She built small stone walls to block the wind. She created shade using scrap metal she found at the dump, angled to protect the youngest plants from the midday sun. She installed a drip irrigation system made from salvaged garden hoses and punctured soda bottles, gravity-fed from a rain barrel she had hauled up the hill in pieces. She worked 18 hours a day. She lost 20 pounds. Her hair fell out in clumps from stress and poor nutrition. Her hands became permanently stained with limestone and chlorophyll. The skin cracked and calloused into something that looked more like bark than flesh. And the plants grew. They grew with a vengeance. They grew with a fury that matched her own. The second-year plants, born from the seeds of survivors, were different from their parents. Stronger, deeper, more determined. Their roots found paths through the stone that Clara couldn't see, anchoring themselves in crevices, wrapping around boulders, creating a web of life where there had been only death. They grew low and wide, their branches spreading across the rock like green rivers, their leaves thick and waxy to resist the heat, their stems woody and tough. By June, the hillside was no longer gray. It was green, not completely, not lushly, but in 80 distinct pockets, life had taken hold. 80 tiny gardens scattered across 7 acres of stone, each one a defiant shout against the verdict of impossible. From the valley below, if you knew where to look, you could see them. Patches of green where no green should be. Spots of color on a canvas of gray. Clara walked among them like a queen surveying her kingdom, her tattered clothes flapping in the wind, her sunburned face split by a grin that would have frightened the people in the valley if they had seen it. It was not a sane grin. It was the grin of someone who had looked at the void and planted a garden in it. July brought flowers, yellow stars scattered across the green, each one a promise of fruit to come. The bees found them this year, drawn by the concentration of pollen in the barren landscape, by the sweetness that stood out against the dust like a song in a silent room. Clara didn't have to pollinate by hand anymore. The insects did it for her, dancing from flower to flower, carrying life on their legs, weaving a network of possibility across the stone. And then came the fruit. Not 1, not 12. Hundreds. Small at first, hard and green, clinging to the vines like emeralds scattered across the rock. Then swelling, then blushing, then turning that impossible, defiant, glorious red that had no business existing on a hillside of gray limestone. Clara harvested the first wave in late July, filling 5-bushel baskets, then 10, then 20. She carried them down the slope in the cool of the morning, her arms trembling, her back screaming, her heart full to bursting. She washed them in the creek. She sorted them on the kitchen table, and she tasted one, just one, to make sure it was real. It was better than the first. It was sweeter somehow, richer, as if the stone had concentrated the flavor, forcing the plant to put every ounce of energy into the fruit, creating a tomato that tasted not just of summer, but of struggle, of victory, of a girl who had refused to quit. She sold her first basket to the diner on Route 9, the one where the truckers stopped for coffee. The owner, a woman named Rita who had known Clara's father, looked at the tomatoes with suspicion. They were small. They were oddly shaped. Some had scars from the stone, but she sliced one for a sandwich, and her eyes went wide. "My God, Clara," she whispered, "what did you do to these?" "I love them," Clara said. More than the rock hated them. Rita bought the whole basket, then another, then another. Within a week, the diner had a sign in the window, "Clara's Impossible Tomatoes, limited supply." Within 2 weeks, there was a line. Within a month, Rita was calling Clara every morning, begging for more, offering double the price, triple, whatever she wanted. The word spread. It spread like the vines themselves, reaching into places Clara had never been. Food bloggers from the city drove up in their clean cars, cameras around their necks, asking for tours of the hillside. Chefs from restaurants with unpronounceable names sent assistants with cash in envelopes, requesting exclusive rights to the harvest. A reporter from the regional newspaper came, took photographs, and wrote a story with the headline, "The Tomato Girl of Millbrook, Defying Science on Stone." Dr. Harrison read the article in his office. He read it twice. He looked at the photographs of the green hillside, of the red fruit against the gray rock, of the girl with the calloused hands and the wild eyes. He put the paper down. He picked up his keys, and he drove to Millbrook Valley for the first time in 15 months. He found Clara on the hillside, as he knew he would. She was tying a vine to a metal stake, her movements efficient and practiced, her body lean and strong from 2 years of labor. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work, and she smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a mocking smile, just a smile, the smile of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Dr. Harrison," she said, "I wondered when you'd come." He looked around. The hillside was transformed, not completely, not into a lush valley farm, but into something else, something stranger, more beautiful. The stone was still there, dominant and ancient, but it was wearing a garment of green now, a patchwork quilt of life that had been stitched into its cracks and crevices. Tomatoes hung everywhere, in clusters, in singles, in impossible locations where no plant should be able to grow. Red against gray, life against death, hope against verdict. "I don't understand," he said. His voice was quiet, almost humble. The soil analysis was clear. The conditions were impossible. The root depth, the water retention, the pH levels. "Your numbers were right," Clara said, cutting a tomato from the vine and handing it to him. "But your conclusion was wrong." He took it. It was warm from the sun, heavy. The skin was slightly scarred from the stone, but the color was perfect. Deep red, almost black. He bit into it, and the flavor exploded across his tongue. Sweet, complex, intense, like no tomato he had ever tasted in his life. It tasted of minerals and sunlight and struggle. It tasted of victory. "How?" he asked, juice running down his chin. "How did you do this?" Clara wiped her hands on her shirt and looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry oranges, the same colors that had greeted her on the first morning. 2 years ago, a lifetime ago. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "I had help from my father, from the rain, from the bees, from the plants themselves, who wanted to live more than the rock wanted them to die." "But the science told you what the rock was," Clara said, turning to face him. "It didn't tell you what I was. It didn't tell you what a 17-year-old girl with a memory and a sack of seeds could do. Your science measures soil, Dr. Harrison. It doesn't measure stubbornness. It doesn't measure love. It doesn't measure the number of times a person is willing to climb a hill with water jugs until her shoulders bleed, just to keep a promise she made to a dead man." She gestured at the hillside. "Your report said this was worthless, but look at it. It's feeding people, it's paying my debts, it's proving that impossible is just a word we use before we try." Dr. Harrison looked at the tomato in his hand. He looked at the girl. He looked at the hillside, and for the first time in his career, he felt something he had spent his life avoiding. He felt small, not in a bad way, in a way that opened doors. He felt the vastness of what he didn't know, and the humility of witnessing something that shouldn't exist. "I was wrong," he said. The words came hard, but they came true. "I was wrong, Clara, and I'm sorry." She smiled. "Don't be sorry. Be curious. Come back next week. I'll show you how I built the irrigation system. Maybe you can help me make it better. Maybe we can figure out how to do this on other hillsides. Maybe there are other girls with rocks and memories, and maybe your science can help them instead of telling them no." He came back. He came back every week. He brought students. He brought equipment. He brought funding from the university to study what Clara had created, not to prove it was impossible, but to understand how it was possible. Together, they developed techniques for rocky terrain agriculture. They published papers. They gave talks. They changed the way people thought about marginal land, and Clara kept farming. By the end of the second year, the hillside was producing 500 pounds of tomatoes per season. By the third year, with Dr. Harrison's help and the university's resources, it was producing 2,000. Other farmers came to learn. Other hillsides were planted. A movement began, small at first, then growing, of people who looked at the barren places of the world and saw not waste but potential. Clara became known as the Tomato Girl, then the Stone Farmer, then simply Clara, the woman who had taught a generation that the only truly barren soil was the soil of a closed mind. She never moved to the valley. She never bought the easy land. She stayed on her hillside, in the farmhouse her father had loved, walking among her vines each morning as the sun rose over the rocks. She married a man who had come to study her techniques and stayed to learn her heart. They had children who grew up climbing the rocks, planting seeds, learning that the world would tell them 1,000 times that something was impossible, and that the only correct response was to try anyway. And every year, on the anniversary of the first tomato, Clara would climb to the highest point of the hillside, where the wind blew strongest and the view stretched forever, and she would sit on a flat rock with a tomato in her hand. She would bite into it, juice running down her chin, seeds spilling onto the stone, and she would whisper the same words she had whispered 2 years ago and 20 years ago, and would whisper until her last breath. Find a way. The rocks had been there for 10,000 years. They would be there for 10,000 more. But now they bore fruit. Now they bore witness. Now they bore the story of a girl who had looked at impossible and had planted it with hope, and the tomatoes grew. Red against gray, life against time, love against everything, they grew.